My name is Dylan. I'm in rabbinical school. I'm a male to female transsexual. I am Asperger's. I'm dyslexic, blind. I'm in a wheelchair. I have dysarthria, so I use AAC, and have non-epileptic seizures and epilepsy. I'm a musician and filmmaker, and I have a BA in history and an MBA in music business.
My name is Margot. I have cerebral palsy. I studied biology at Penn State Harrisburg, and I'm an independent filmmaker.
What is the frontal lobe and where is it in the brain?
The frontal lobe is in the front of the brain near the forehead and controls most voluntary movements in the body. When it is damaged, it can cause a loss of brain functions. The functions lost can involve emotional regulation, executive function, social interaction, and movements for walking and speaking. How does the frontal lobe affect autism?
In autism, the frontal lobe is either overactive or underactive, so the autistic person has trouble with social interaction, speaking, and executive function.
Does the frontal lobe affect dyslexia?
Dyslexics sometimes have unusual brain activity in the speech and reading parts of the brain. How does the frontal lobe relate to cerebral palsy?
In cerebral palsy, if the frontal lobe is damaged, it can cause something called apraxia or ataxic cerebral palsy, since the cerebellum at the back of the brain is interconnected with the frontal lobe. A movement from having to do with balance is called ataxia. There is a type of cerebral palsy called ataxic cerebral palsy, where a person has a ton of issues balancing and knowing where they are and where their limbs are. People with CP who have frontal lobe damage often have dysarthria and something called the gag reflex. An OPWDD worker thought Dylan had cerebral palsy because of this. The gag reflex is when you go into a fight or flight response, and the involuntary gag is a physical thing that often gets set off by stress. Acid reflux can make the gag reflex worse, and if triggered enough, can cause projectile vomiting. How does it feel when you gag, Dylan?
My gag is triggered by seizures and opening my mouth very wide or going outside my limited diet and causes projectile vomiting, which means I cannot swallow pills. My gag makes going to the dentist extremely complicated. Although my gag is not caused by stress, it does physical strain and stress caused by the physical trauma to my body. I scream and cry and feel like I'm dying when I vomit. I have had episodes where I threw up 40 times a day. I have even thrown up in my sleep and had vomit come up my nose and eyes. What is spasticity and how does it affect the mouth?
Spasticity is tight muscles and high muscle tone caused by nervous system dysfunction. Most people with spasticity have it to some degree all over the body, including in their mouth. The spasticity in the mouth can cause issues with singing, volume control, and speech. It can make some mouth movements painful or cause a lack of sensation in the mouth and swallowing issues. How does your spasticity affect your mouth, Dylan?
My muscles lock and it hurts to eat. Because I have a connective tissue disorder, I have dislocated my jaw. Sometimes after a seizure, my muscles lock and it is hard to speak. Even when I can speak, it hurts to speak.
My name is and
What is selective mutism?
Selective mutism is classified as an anxiety-based impairment where someone can physically talk but don't in certain situations or with certain people. Different people have different reasons. It is not always due to trauma. Trauma causing it is a stereotype. Sometimes people with selective mutism have PTSD, but many don't. I was personally selectively mute from ages 8 to 15. How is bipolar, selective mutism, epilepsy and non-epileptic seizures related?
These conditions are all interrelated because they follow similar chemical and electrical pathways in the frontal lobe part of the brain. Many people who are selectively mute become bipolar as adults, including Dylan.
When I first got to Israel, I had a really bad episode that was out of character where I was rapid cycling and confused. I had brain fog and I was in pain. I didn't know what I was saying. I might have fallen and hit my head, but I'm not sure.
Years later in Florida, after a bad seizure, Dylan had a similar episode where she could not remember what had happened during her time living in Texas and was crying, so I had to read her own writings from Texas so she would remember and calm down again. Neurofatigue is the medical term for brain fog, and it is when the brain itself is tired and not functioning properly after a seizure or injury or inflammation in the brain. Both Lyme disease and Lupron cause inflammation that can cause severe neurofatigue. A doctor told Dylan that her brain nodules near her thalamus and cerebellum cause inflammation leading to epileptic seizures and sensory loss to all of her limbs and visual distortions because the thalamus processes all sensory information and the inflammation near the cerebellum makes Dylan have no fine motor control.
What are fine motor skills?
Fine motor skills are smaller, detailed movements. So if someone has fine motor impairment, they might have issues doing buttons or tying shoes. I could not tie my own shoes until age 12.
What is an MRI?
An MRI is a scan of the brain or other body part that is done with a giant magnet. Sometimes during an MRI, the doctor will use something called contrast, which is a white substance that makes things that are harder to see in the brain easier for a doctor to see. Unfortunately, chemical message cannot be seen on certain brain scans, so brains can look quote-unquote normal structurally, but still be damaged. This is why mental health conditions having to do with chemical messages generally won't show up on these certain types of scans either. On Dylan's MRI, it showed that Dylan has a small underdeveloped cerebellum, which is seen in both autism and ataxia. When the cerebellum is damaged or not developed, it causes cerebral palsy-like symptoms, and the cerebellum sends the wrong messages to the frontal lobe, causing some of the faulty messages that cause Dylan's seizures. Dylan also has a few nodules and arachnoid cysts that do not cause epilepsy, but it is a sign that Dylan's epilepsy has been present since birth. One nodule is near Dylan's thalamus, which is known to cause chronic pain and sensory overload. It would do more damage than good to remove the cysts. Functional MRI is a different type of MRI that shows how the brain is functioning and can detect functional neurological disorder by showing if the motor signals fired during emotions. How does it feel to get an MRI?
As far as I'm concerned, an MRI feels like a day at the spa. When I own an MRI machine, it feels sensory seeking for my autism when sitting in the machine because I typically listen to rock and roll. In the MRI, I get the red carpet treatment with a Hoyer lift when I usually only get to see people's butts, which makes for good eye candy for bisexuals like me. How does connective tissue disorder factor into the brain?
Connective tissue disorders are linked to frontal lobe changes, epilepsy, dystonia, and slow healing from injury like brain injury, and is strongly linked to gender dysphoria and stomach issues, all of which Dylan does have.
How does vitamin B affect the brain?
Without vitamin B, the brain does not function properly, causing pain, eye issues, leg issues, lack of red blood cells, blood clots, and psychosis, like Dylan's bipolar episode after getting to Israel, and eventually acidosis and death.
I came to find out that I was in acidosis and would have been dead within hours if I had not gone to the hospital.
How does estrogen affect the frontal lobe?
Estrogen causes increased brain activity in the frontal lobe. This is part of why Dylan's frontal lobe is overactive. since she takes estrogen.
How do demographics factor in?
In genetics, if a population becomes too small, a lot of genetic mutations that are not good for the organism start appearing because of a lack of genetic diversity. When a population gets too close to extinction, this is called the genetic bottleneck.
Okay, genetic bottlenecks. Hitler created a genetic bottleneck by killing so many people. A genetic bottleneck, in founder effect, is where a population is more closely related, resulting in more genetic conditions. An example of this is autism, a developmental disability that impairs social interaction and sensory integration. There has been a long-term goal of many organizations, including not limited to Autism Speaks, to find a gene for autism, cure it, and wipe it from the human genome. Autism Speaks had a campaign in the early 2000s where their slogan was Cure Autism Now.
When a population is too genetically similar, that population and potentially the whole species can die off due to disease or major natural disaster because they have no ability to adapt or change. This lack of diversity has already caused many animals and plant species to go extinct.
What is the connection between the eyes and the brain?
The optic nerve sends signals from the eye to the brain. If the brain does not interpret the signal correctly, like when someone has a lack of vitamin B, it will cause a loss of vision. Dylan has a lack of blood flow to her left eye that happened at some point. So your brain must be able to receive and interpret electrical signals from the eye in order for you to see. If your brain cannot communicate with your eyes, you can have problems with the balance, and if the balance part of your brain is damaged, you can have problems seeing.
How does the frontal lobe affect migraines?
Migraines can be caused by overactivity in the frontal lobe. Dylan has a migraine disorder and color blindness, which are genetically linked to each other. Lyme disease can also cause vision changes. Another condition that Dylan may also have is called Stargardt's disease, which a character in my film Dramacided has. Recently, new genes have been discovered for Stargardt's disease, which cause vision loss similar to Dylan's. Dylan most likely has the most severe type.
What's the best part of having a TBI?
For me, having a brain injury in the form of cerebral palsy gave me a deeper understanding of my own body and body language of the characters I play as an actor, and it gave me the opportunity to meet great people like Dylan. Dylan, what's the best part of having a TBI for you?
The best part about having a TBI is my spastic friends and a renewed sense of disability pride. Is there anything to be gained from having a TBI?
In some cases, a TBI can lead to increased skills. Some people get dyslexia after a head injury, which, despite being another disability, causes better creativity, and many business owners are dyslexic. Dyslexia happens from changes in which hemisphere is being used after a traumatic brain injury. A person's hemisphere can become disconnected from each other since usually the hemispheres are connected. Some people with TBI developed increased language skills in some instances.
Just as biodiversity is important for a flourishing ecosystem, so neurodiversity is important for a flourishing society, human society.